very much, Tracy. Just let that just come in. Sorry. So thank you very much, Tracy. Real warm welcome. Great to have everyone here today. Like Tracy's already said, second year running. First year was incredibly successful. So very excited to see the second year underway with a absolutely star-studded pack of speakers, I must say. So as Tracy said, my name is Dr. Max Stone. I'm a lecturer here at Newcastle University, and I lecture in sport and exercise psychology. Worked alongside Tracy and Adam to get this conference up and running. As Tracy has said, we've got a keynote speaker this morning. The purpose of the keynote is to give you a real in-depth insight into a topic of choice by the keynote speaker. The keynote speakers are unique. They are individuals who are experts in their area, both in terms of academic and also applied insight. So you're going to get some real interesting information from these individuals. In terms of the practicalities of the talk, it's 40 minutes with 10 minutes of questions. Please save your questions till the end. Make sure you're muted. If you do have questions as you go, please put them in the chat and I'll ask the question to the speaker at the end. Alternatively, you can hold your question until the end of the talk, and then you can just come on the mic and ask it yourself. Like I said, please try and stay muted throughout the talk, just so we can direct our attention to the speaker and make sure that they deliver it in a really sort of engaging and excellent way. So now to our actual speaker. So our speaker this morning is Professor David Shearer. David is a Professor of Elite Performance Psychology at the University of South Wales and also a Health and Care Professions Council registered sports psychologist. David's published over 40 research articles on a range of topics in sports psychology, including team dynamics, recovery and fatigue, and also the psychology of extreme performance. He's also the performance psychology lead for the Welsh Institute of Performance Science, which is a solution-driven research group looking to enhance the performance of elite Welsh athletes. David also has extensive experience of applied consultancy, having worked with and continuing to work with athletes and teams at Olympic, Paralympic, and Commonwealth level. On a more personal note, this is a small academic coming of age moment for myself. I've known David for a fair amount of time now and supervised me from undergraduate all the way to PhD level. So it's a real privilege to be able to chair the session today and to welcome him to the conference. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to David, whose talk title this morning is Creating Thriving Environments in High Performance Contexts.
Morning, everybody. Max, I will try and work Zoom to get my slides up on screen. So everyone bear with me for a moment. I'm not much of a Zoom user. We're not officially allowed to use them at our university. So this should be interesting in terms of getting it to go. Bear with me. I've got the bar over the top. Can everyone see my slides? Happy days. Just let me get to the start. That'd be great. You can't see the presenter view, can you, on your screens the other side? Okay, it's worked. Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. So assuming everyone can hear me, I will make a start. And thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Max, for that over-embellished introduction. I hope I can sort of live up to the standards that you set for me. I'm actually quite surprised that you invited me to be the talk today. I obviously was not mean enough to you during the time that you were my PhD student. But yeah, hopefully I can do a good job, live up to the expectations that you've set for the listeners this morning. Okay, so today my talk is entitled Creating Thriving Environments in Sport. And this is a project that is a co-collaboration between an entity that Max mentioned in my introduction, the Welsh Institute of Performance Science, and Sport Wales Institute, or Sport Wales more largely. Now, the topic of thriving itself, despite the fact that Max says I'm an expert in lots of different things, I'm actually not an expert in thriving. And this will become clear as to why that is when I start talking about the activity of WIPS, or Welsh Institute of Performance Science, and the project itself. So I don't class myself as an expert. So if there are any thriving experts within the room, I do apologize if I get anything wrong. But the emphasis of this is a case study of the type of activity that the Welsh Institute of Performance Science does with the people that we work with, the sports and Sport Wales. But it's also quite timely, I think, because the landscape of elite sport has changed in the last 5 years, certainly. It was beginning to change in the last 10 years. And this move away from probably an overemphasis on winning medals and almost treating athletes a bit like robots, dare I say it, and not human beings, to one where we're much more focused and emphasizing the importance of the human being behind the sport as well. So thriving speaks volumes to that kind of philosophy. So a bit about me to begin with. As Max said, I am a prof of elite performance psychology at the University of South Wales. And in my role as prof, I have researched in lots of different areas of sports psychology, but my career began, I say began in inverted commas, as a sports psychologist all the way back in Sydney in 2000, where I was the sports psychologist for the Great Britain wheelchair basketball. And I had the privilege to observe and watch a magnificent team culture in which sadly we missed out on the bronze medal with a last-minute ditched three-point shot from the US. I mean, last second, actually, the buzzer went as the ball was in the air and we missed out on a bronze medal. But since that point, working within that team environment, I've become passionate about team processes and team environments and cultures and so on and so forth. Can I just check, is on my screen, I've got a tab here of everyone's faces. Is that covering the slides? You know it isn't. Okay, that's great. Put that over there. So I'm very passionate about team processes and cultures and environments, and this project fits very nicely in there. Now, as an academic, I class myself as a pracademic. I'm not really interested in research that is based in the lab and is based with the sole focus of creating publications, because generally speaking, sports don't like that. Sports find it difficult to translate. So all of my research is predominantly focused on being easily translatable. So anything that I do, I want it to have an immediate impact. I want it to change the way sports do things in a positive way. So you'll see how this project fits within that quite nicely, and a lot of my work does. I'm also, as Max said, a consultant, and he's already introduced that. And I've worked with many sports over the last, dare I say it, 22 years, which makes me sigh a little bit. But it's provided me with a rich experience, which then informs my research as well. So everything complements each other. But today I'm not going to talk about that. Today I'm going to talk and focus on the Welsh Institute of Performance Science, or WIPS, which is perhaps an unfortunate acronym, I must admit, and the activity that we do. But I'll give you a brief, no, my slides aren't moving on. Apologies, guys, there you go. I will give you a brief introduction as to what we're going to talk about more broadly through the process of this presentation. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to give you a little bit of context about Sport Wales and WIPS and what the project's all about. I'll also give you a bit of background about the theory and what we already know in the literature of thriving, which is something, as I've already indicated, I wasn't an expert in at the time that this project came to being. Talk a bit about the building blocks of thriving, which is quite a useful starting point for you guys to understand what it's all about. And then we're going to look specifically about what WIPS and Sport Wales have done over the last 2 years, really, in developing this project, and the things that we found, and now how we're using the information that we've generated from the sports that we've worked with, the kind of the changes in their environments and the thriving environments. And then a little bit about the vision about what Sport Wales and WIPS are hoping to do with this work moving on into the future. So what is WIPS? What is the Welsh Institute of Performance Science? Well, effectively, we are or have become the research arm of Sport Wales Institute. And in fact, Max has mentioned that he was my PhD student. His whole PhD programme fit within WIPS when he worked with Welsh Swimming. But the idea is that Sport Wales Institute is fairly small in terms of the number of practitioners that they have. So they don't really have the capacity to do research or answer the kind of elite sport questions that the sports have, or indeed test innovations and so on and so forth. So back in 2015, Sport Wales and myself at University of South Wales and a couple of academics, including Liam Kilduff at Swansea University, met with Sport Wales to try and come up with a solution for this problem. And from that, WIPS was born. And as you can see on this diagram, we have a range of expertise. And the one thing that all of us have in common is that we're passionate academics. We're not interested as much as in the actual publications. We're much more interested in what we can do for the sports and how we can change practice. And with the current state of play, we have got over 28 projects on the go. This year alone, we've made 40 presentations back to the sports and to Sport Wales, and we're engaging with national governing bodies and other UK sports institutes like the Scottish Institute of Sport and English Institute of Sport. And we are also securing more and more funding now to do this kind of research from external sources as well. So if you like, today's talk is going to be much more like a case study about what we do. And the reason why I want to talk to you about that is because I think it's an example of good practice. I think it's a way in which sports, academia, practitioners can all engage together to provide solutions that benefit sport. And hopefully you'll see that illustrated as we go through the presentation. Okay, so it's probably worth a bit of context, in a wider context in terms of where this project came from. And in 2020, Sport Wales, which is the Welsh government organisation that manages all sports, particularly Commonwealth, Olympic type sports, lottery funded type sports in Wales, they initiated a all Wales survey to ask the people of Wales what they thought about the state of the nation in terms of sport. And this survey asked all sorts of questions in relation to facilities, the environment, opportunities, inclusivity, etc., etc. And from that survey, the tagline that you see there on the right-hand side was born: enabling sport in Wales to thrive. Now, this tagline was very prominent in the Welsh media. It was on all of the social media that Sport Wales were promoting at the time. And naturally, the Sport Wales Institute, which is the arm of Sport Wales that provides support to elite athletes, were very keen to understand how they could embed this notion of thriving into what they were doing. And what they were doing at that moment in time was changing their whole focus. So I mentioned at the start how we've changed, or beginning to change, as a wide industry, away from this focus-driven approach to medal winning and much more on the holistic approach of the athlete. Well, Sport Wales wanted to change away, not from entirely away from performance and medal winning, but wanted to focus much more on this thing that they tabbed inclusive athlete development. And that basically meant that they wanted to ensure that every person, whether they made it in sport or not, had the same opportunities. So nothing would count against them. So if a sport was expensive, then they would try to find ways to make sure that everybody could excel in that sport. Particularly when you look at it at the elite level, you might have some sports, for example, you make it into a national team, you actually have to pay your own way. They weren't happy with that. They wanted to make sure. And they could see, therefore, how thriving fit this, because everyone, if you want an inclusive athlete development pathway, everyone should be able to thrive in their sport. And that was the big idea. So they wanted to understand what thriving was. And so they approached us in WIPS to start providing some of those answers. So they wanted to know what the literature said about thriving. They wanted to know what it meant for them as practitioners and how they operate, and what in terms of what they're doing with sports. But they also wanted to ensure that sports were able to understand what thriving meant for them, because the big thing that they wanted to do was to develop a common language that sports could use to understand this thriving concept. Not that everyone should be doing the same thing, and we'll come on to that later, but that with this common language, sports could forge their own ways in their own environments to create thriving, or the opportunity for thriving for their athletes. Now, whilst I lead this project from a WIP's perspective, at the coalface on the ground, this project is very much being driven by two people. First is Dr. Hamish Cox, and he is the Senior Research Assistant at the University of South Wales, aligned to this project, aligned to Welsh Institute of Performance Science. And the second person is Kath Shearer, who's the head of Inclusive Athlete Development. And those of you who are on the ball will notice that she has the same surname as me. And yes, she is my wife. So move on. Okay, so what is thriving? So I'm going to be really, really honest here. I must admit that when I saw the tagline on the Sport Wales webpage and read their sort of report that they put together, I was slightly cynical about this term thriving. There are lots of buzzwords that appear in sports psychology that have an air of scienciness or truthiness, and dare I say it, a little bit of corporate BS, okay? And I got the sense that this was a little bit like that. But then actually, when we started digging around in the literature, we came across not only stuff outside in the wider psychology domain, but stuff within sports psychology, in particular in a group down at Loughborough University, led by Brown et al., who were doing lots of good stuff. And it became very apparent quickly that this concept of thriving, not only was there real substance to it from a psych perspective, but there was also real relevance in terms of what Sport Wales wanted to achieve within their inclusive athlete development pathway. So we then, on the basis of what we read, came up with, I suppose, our own view of it in terms of how it fed into this inclusive athlete development. And for us, the things that we picked out were firstly philosophical and then outcome based, and they'll become clear as we go through. But firstly, number one, it was a human first approach. It very much placed the human, the athlete, or it made the athlete a human first rather than a performer. And that was really, really important, and it fit well with what Sport Wales' strategy was. But what that said basically was that every single athlete or participant in sport will have a unique individual pathway to thriving. No one person will thrive for the same reasons or in the same landscape or in the same environment. It's completely unique. And likewise, no one sport will be the same. So what is thriving in boxing will look very different to what is thriving in swimming, for example, because the culture is very, very different. So too are perhaps the demographics of the people that are currently involved in it. The fourth point there, though, is even more important. A lot of the literature looks at thriving through sport, but what Sport Wales are very keen on, and the reason they were very keen on this is because they understand that not every single person that takes part in a sport is going to make it. So the large majority of people that have a dream of being an athlete, being an elite athlete, don't make it. Okay, so they spend a long time training, working hard, and then they fall out of that sport. What Sport Wales wanted to make sure is that thriving occurs through sport, so when you're in it, around sport, so that it's not just you as an athlete, it's thriving in all other aspects of your life, and then perhaps most importantly, beyond sport. So at the end of your career, that you've learned stuff through your participation in sport that allows you to thrive as a human being in whatever pathway that you then take. And then the outcomes of that, I guess, fall from those things, that it leads to success and development, not just in sport, but in all domains. But then from a sport perspective, we have athletes that have good, strong well-being, but also are able to perform at the highest level. Okay, so as I mentioned, Sport Wales haven't forgotten about medals. They don't, they want athletes to perform at the highest level, but they're placing the athlete as a human being first. So I want to talk now about some of the sort of like fundamental literature that underpins it. So it gives you a better understanding as to what thriving actually is and where it comes from. So there are three things I want to talk about over the next couple of slides. The first is basic needs, which hopefully some of you will be aware of already, but I'll explain that in a bit more detail. The second and third are what we call enablers, personal enablers and contextual enablers, and they'll become clear as I talk about them. So I'm aware that we probably have coaches in the room, we probably have psychologists in the room, probably have academics in the room, and there's going to be a broad breadth of expertise on different areas of psychology. So just to give this a basic introduction, basic needs theory is a subdivision of self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is probably the most widely accepted theory of human motivation and behavior. So it provides fairly consistent predictions about why and how we participate in activities, whether that's sport or anything else. Basically, it explains why we get out of bed in the morning. You know, from every activity from there forth, it has an explanation in terms of what drives us forward. Now, the basic needs theory is a sub-theory, as I've mentioned, and it comprises of three things. It suggests that everyone needs these three things to a greater or lesser extent in order to take part in the activities that they want to do, to maintain their motivation, if you like. The first of these is competence, and this is fairly easy to understand. We like to be good at stuff as human beings, whatever that stuff is, whether it's sport, whether it's driving a car, whatever, we like to be good at it. Because when we're good at something, it makes us feel good about ourselves. And when we feel good about ourselves, it makes us more likely that we'll return to that activity in the future. Number two, relatedness. We are social beings. So we like to have someone to do stuff with. And when we've done that stuff, we like to be able to talk to someone about that stuff. We like to interact. We are social beings. We like to be connected. We like to feel that we can care for somebody else and they can care for us. So relatedness is a really important part as well of these thriving environments. And then the final one is autonomy. Fundamental to who we are is that we like to have a choice in the stuff that we do. Okay, we don't like to feel forced. We like to make sure that what we do matches with our vision of who we are, our self, our integrated self. So being able to choose our path in life or our path in sport, or at least being able to contribute to decisions that are made about our lives, is a big part of maintaining motivation and is a fundamental part of this idea of thriving as well. So this slide here, this next slide, is a infographic that was put together for Sport Wales and for the sports to kind of demonstrate the bigger picture. Now on this slide, we have some elements of basic needs, but we also have aspects that cover the personal enablers and the contextual enablers. So if we look at the bottom of the screen, we have the person, and we can see feeding into the person, we have the skills and we have the characteristics. So the skills that the person might have might be things like, I don't know, imagery, goal setting, coping skills, whereas the characteristics might be things such as resilience, commitment, positive attitude, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the person, and that's wide ranging, and they bring with them those factors. They then enter this notion, this pathway up towards development. And along that pathway, we have all the different contextual enablers. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these contextual enablers, but I'm going to pick a few out that I think are important. So I mentioned right at the beginning, there are unique elements dependent on the sports that we're working with. So again, I'll use the sort of examples. Boxing versus swimming, for example, are very different training environments. One of them's in water, one of them's on the land. That's the most obvious thing. One of them, you spend 4 hours a day staring at the bottom of the pool. One of them, you spend time in a sort of 3 meter by 3, I'm not sure how big a boxing ring is, but 3 meter by 3 meter ring hitting people or hitting pads. So there's a different culture, there's a different environment. So we have to consider that. High quality relationships is also massively important. So having a team around the athletes, or having even a team around the coach is important. And the people that play an important part, particularly in the athletes' lives, are the coach, the family, the teammates, and the sports staff. And I want to emphasize actually the role of parents in there. Parents have a massive role to play across these types of relationships. So my slides seem to be self-animating themselves, and the boxes are appearing by themselves. So they're racing ahead of me. I'm not quite sure why they're doing that. So I'll move down the list. Things like physical safety, and across the other side, we've got psychological safety as well. We take these, or we think we should take these for granted, but it's not always the case. In lots of sports, in lots of sports settings, particularly around Wales, you might find instances where that isn't the case. I'm a coach in rugby, for example, and I watch coaches of other teams. And sometimes I am concerned that the psychological safety of some of these young kids that I'm on the opposite team that I'm coaching isn't taken care of. We have things like trust. So at the highest level, athletes performing at the highest level have a need to know that they can trust the coach that they're working with. And likewise, the coach needs to have a feeling that they can trust the athlete that they're working with to try their hardest. Role models, another important one. In the environment, having aspirations of people that you look up to, people that you can work towards in terms of what their pathway is, and gives you a sort of like a target for your work, but also this free flow of information that might occur between different levels of athletes, like the new athletes and the older athletes. So you begin to get a picture of the different kind of contextual enablers that are part of the picture. And then the idea is that we head towards this notion of success and development. And at the top, this is the bit that is really important, as I've already mentioned, to Sport Wales. We notice that sport is just one of 5 elements that they're classing as success and development. This bigger picture, rather than looking at just sport, they're interested in how these people contribute to their community, how they contribute to their family, how they contribute to the school, how they contribute to work. And this provides this overall picture of thriving. Okay. Just checking my time, it's been 4 minutes. Okay, so what have we done? So the remit that appeared or was worked upon between Sport Wales and Welsh Institute for Performance Science was that we wanted to begin to explore the current landscape within each and every sport in Wales, because only by understanding their current landscape, their current environment, can we begin to understand how we can make necessary changes or help sports make necessary changes to establish this notion of thriving environments. So for each sport that we work with, and there were 3 sports that we have initially started working with, all with national and international athletes competing on the world stage, we had a working group, and predominantly this working group comprised of sports psychology practitioners at Sport Wales, the lead performance lifestyle practitioners, the performance directors from the sports, the national coaches from the sports, and the developments and performance pathway managers also within those sports. So you can see it wasn't just an academic driven project or even a Sport Wales driven project. This was a co-creation, everyone working together to figure out the best way to get this information and to then work together to make changes to what was found. So 2 ways that it was done initially, and this might change. This work is still going on, so it's research in action, really. It's stuff that's happening at this moment in time. With the coaches, we ran focus groups, and we ran focus groups with a mixture of performance level, as in people working with medalists or intended medalists, all the way down to club coaches. So we wanted that big picture, and we got loads of coaches within the room and asked them questions, and you'll see some of their responses in a minute. We also surveyed the athletes with a questionnaire pack. So as it stands at the moment, surveys are still coming in, but we to this moment in time, you have 51 athletes who completed the online survey across the 3 sports. And we measured things like stress, their perceptions of the development environment they were performing in, what their learning climate was like, and then also their psychological well-being as well. So it gave us a fairly broad picture of what we felt were the most important aspects of Thrive. Now, in the ideal world, we'd have also liked to do, and may well do in the future, athlete focus groups. But there's so many athletes, it becomes quite difficult to actually do that and slows the progress down. So this is just to give you a little bit of flavour about the insight that we've gained from this project to date. As I said, information is still coming in from questionnaires, and we've got more focus groups to do across different sports as well. But we split this down into information that was garnered from the coaches and information that was garnered through the survey from the athletes. And there is some tally between them, definitely, as you'll see as we work through them. So from the coach's perspective, this was a theme that was at the heart of everything. The coach-athlete relationship is really, really, really important to enable athletes to thrive and for coaches to thrive as well. So having strong relationships with athletes is a big part of how it begins and how it's maintained as well. But coaches were also very keen to point out that, and I think this was more from a performance coach down to a developmental coach, that coaches shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes in making these changes or in developing environments in which athletes can thrive, because it's a complex picture, it's a complex landscape. It encompasses so many moving parts that actually it's inevitable that coaches will make mistakes along the way, but it shouldn't stop you from doing it. It shouldn't stop you from trying to develop environments in which athletes can thrive. Also, coaches, at the same time of having this notion of thriving and this focus on the athlete as a human being, understand that actually, if we still have one handle on performance, that it is still important that we create challenging environments. And in fact, athletes want that, and we'll see that in a moment. So the pathway to elite level, to international competition, isn't a flat pathway. It has to be a bumpy road. From the bumps in the road, we develop the coping strategies that we need to become the best athletes in the world. So there's lots of literature on this notion of challenge, or dare I say it, even trauma, and how that impacts upon the coping skills and the mental toughness and the resilience that athletes develop. And those characteristics, mental toughness, resilience, are a part as well of thriving. One of the negatives that perhaps came out from the coaches is, how do coaches thrive themselves in an environment where they feel they want it more than the athletes? So that's a topic that's open for discussion, and perhaps one of the factors that we're looking more closely at the moment is, how do you tally up different motivations and drives between coaches and athletes? And then the final one from the coaches, and I think this is really important from the perspective of basic needs, is that everyone is clear on the why. So all the coaches understand why they're doing what they're doing if they're a part of a team, but more importantly, athletes understand the why. They understand the direction, strategy, the culture of why it's happening and why they're being asked to complete certain sets, etc. So they're brought along for the ride. There's this open communication that allows for it. On the flip side now, we've got the responses from the athletes, and these were taken from the questionnaires, so they're not quite as nuanced or rich in terms of information compared to what we got from the focus groups. But things like, we already now know that actually most athletes within the 3 sports that we surveyed already have good levels of autonomy. So that's a positive, that's really helpful, that's a good starting place. I don't know whether they will find that in all the sports, and as we see, we're going on to look at more of the sports in Wales. But rather concerningly, and perhaps on this fits in with the relatedness aspect of with basic needs theory, is that social anxiety is really common in athletes. They're worried about how they're perceived by others, by coaches, by other athletes. And as we'll see later, this idea of having role models and inspiration, and having a free flow of information is important. And if that's not happening, that's likely to lead to social anxiety if people aren't communicating how they're feeling. So matching up also with what the coaches said about challenging environments, the athletes recognize that growth mindset is really important, that they need to go through setbacks and they need to learn how to manage those potential setbacks in order for them to be able to achieve the goals that they've set for themselves. And by achieving those goals, that's one part of their thriving process as well. But the last two are really telling, I think, of perhaps the culture that is still clinging on in sport. Athletes highlighted that there needed to be more conversations with them about their lives outside of sport. They wanted people to understand who they were outside of being athletes. Also, they felt like they needed greater help in being able to manage the tasks and responsibilities that they have on an everyday basis. So they spend so much time focused being an athlete that perhaps basic skills that all of us might have had if we weren't elite athletes, like cooking, etc., and managing finances, etc., they get left by the wayside. So there was some useful insight. And this is literally a snapshot. So there was so much more, but I could be here all day if I continue to go through that. And no one wants that. Okay, so what have we done with this information so far? So the whole point of this is that we make changes. And that's what the sports wanted to take part in this activity for. So the broad picture is, at the moment, there are a number of sort of media-based information packages that we've put together that have been released not only to the 3 sports that we work with, but to all the sports in Wales. And those are freely available. And some of them I've been making use of today, and on some of my other slides you'll see that come up. I can show you them later. And the idea behind these is that these infographics and these media, some of them are videos, etc., they act as a primer for the other sports to get the hook, almost, if you like, to bring them in, to get them to understand the benefits that this emphasis on thriving will have on their athletes and perhaps their culture overall within their sport. So there are guidelines for contextual enablers, and then we also have put together guidelines for the personal enablers, which is mostly more focused towards the one-to-one stuff that, for example, sports psychologists might be doing with their athletes within the institute. But the more specific stuff we're doing is trying to take the sport specific, so each of the focus groups and each of the surveys, we are able to identify from which sport they came, and we're able to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of those sports in terms of their existing environments and where changes might happen, and helping sports to understand what it means to them. And certain sports are now using this information to deal with specific projects or specific issues or specific problems. So one of the sports we work with in particular has an issue at age group with female athletes who, between different age groups, the transition between age groups, they're seeing a high dropout rate. And they're wondering why that is, what elements in their environment and in the culture around that age group transition is causing this dropout. So they're applying some of the principles that we looked at from a thriving perspective to understand this problem and being guided through that by Sport Wales. But the bigger picture is that overall, the information is being used to change cultures, but change cultures that match with the sports and match with the individual problems that they have. So I didn't want to leave you today without some of the kind of more specific stuff that we feel is the way, or are the ways, of developing thriving environments. And we've kind of split this down, and this is again one of the infographics that was provided to sports that gives them sort of some insight into the types of things and small changes that they might make at a cultural level that will impact upon their environments overall. So the 5 headings are training groups, role models, development of psychosocial skills, long-term development, and a strong, coherent organizational culture. But I'll talk a bit more about each of those in turn. So out of the focus groups, one of the things that came out was this notion of the importance of training groups. So this came out that many athletes and coaches reported that athletes found it isolating if they only had themselves and a coach to train with. And so opportunities for inclusion in a training community was a massive part of it. Now, you would think that in most sports that would be the case anyway, but it isn't always the case. And the big part of that is that if you have supportive relationships and friendships that span performance levels, so it's not just we have an isolated performance group. So for example, some sports in Wales, you may only have one athlete who is performing at what's called the performance level, the top end. So in those instances, that one athlete can often feel isolated, instead of making them part of a wider training group that entails and allows for the transfer of information. And that brings me on to role models next. This idea that within the cohort of athletes that you have a community of practice, you have a knowledge base that allows for more experienced athletes to pass on knowledge to less experienced athletes. So developing cultures where elite athletes are willing to pass on their knowledge to the up and coming athletes. They're not veiled, that the secrets of what they do aren't hidden away. They are open access, knowing that they are passing on what was beneficial to them to the athletes that are coming up next through the pathway. Then number 3, development of psychosocial skills. This is one of the ones that's most important to Sport Wales as a whole. So going back to the big picture, where we want athletes to have the skills that they need to thrive outside of sport as well, so that if they leave sport, that they are or have been developed by their sport as a whole human being rather than just as an athlete. And then the 4th one, long-term development. There are too many sports that tend to have a focus on short-term success and treat athletes or their kids within their pathway as miniature elite athletes. So the recommendations we're making there is that there should be a much more of a focus on long-term development rather than early success, and that actually training should be age appropriate in terms of the amount and the content of training that they do. And then the final one, which is more big picture, is coherent organizational culture. All sports, if they are to thrive, should have a set of core values about what defines them, who they are, why they do what they do, and what they believe in as an organization. Because that kind of sort of document, if it was a document, or those kind of values that are written down and understood by athlete, provides stability to the group and supports a learning environment. It makes athletes aware and understand what the big picture is. And if you don't have that, you tend to have a sort of fragmented culture, which has a lack of common vision, and no one knows in which direction they are pulling. From equipping individuals and sort of personal enablers, I'm not going to go into too much detail because this stuff is already out there. It's available in the literature already. So the psychological characteristics of developing excellence is one framework that you might use, or sports psychologists might use, to understand the type of skill sets that athletes are going to need to not only thrive in their sport, but also thrive outside of their sport as well. So things like commitment, self-awareness, coping with pressure, goal setting. These are all the types of skills that you as practitioners, as sports psychologists, as coaches will only be too well aware of. But how often do we pay lip service to them? Okay, how often do they not get formally planned into the training of our athletes? And how often are they emphasized not only as skills for sport, but also skills for life? So what next? Bring this to a close now, because I appreciate that I'm ticking over the time. Sorry, Max. Sport Wales aim to embed the notion of thriving into the culture of sport in Wales. Okay, that's their big picture aim. And as it stands over the next couple of years, the project, this year already, the project is beginning to be rolled out to over 11 different sports. And the key thing to emphasize again is that this will always remain a sport-led project. And that is the way that you engage sport best, is if you engage with them, you understand their context. So it's a co-created research that matches the sport's needs with the guidance from Sport Wales and the Welsh Institute of Performance Science. And they're now getting a lot of interest from outside the more typical Commonwealth and Olympic type sports that Sport Wales support. And some of the more private sector sports are engaging with this as well and like the content and want to embed it within their practice. So at the beginning of this, I said that I was using this notion of thriving environments as a case study of what Welsh Institute of Performance Science does. And the reason I wanted to highlight that today was because actually I think it is best practice in terms of if you want to have innovation and research that complements the needs of sports, then developing these types of networks is massively beneficial to all people involved. And the reason for that is that what we do has an immediate impact. It's always focused on changing practice or impacting on performance or changing cultures. It's less concerned with publishing. And to that end, as an organisation, we've been commended recently in the Welsh Government report for what we do with Sport Wales. And in fact, Sport Wales were recommended to continue doing this long into the future. And we have similar networks now created for community exercise and health as well within Wales. So I'm going to end my talk there. I hope it's been of some use, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. That was a really interesting, insightful talk. Have we got any questions from the floor? I can see we've got Adam's hand up. Adam, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks for that, Max. Thank you very much for that talk. That was really interesting, David. I, as somebody who's really interested in kind of the social side of psychology within sport in particular, you mentioned the coach-athlete relationship being key, and we'd like to hope that our coaches obviously are certainly aware of that. But from your experience working with coaches and providing recommendations and guidelines, what do you see as some of those key errors that coaches might face sometimes when they're trying to be proactive and develop positive relationships with their athletes, but it doesn't always work out? So it's one of those terms that we see a lot in the literature. But what are some of those key areas that you see where there is a breakdown of relationship or that positive relationship doesn't actually develop?
From my experience, and particularly in the kind of developmental pathway, certainly, and in training groups, one of the main failings is in communication, and not just communication per se, but many of these athletes are young and many of these coaches are older, so shall we say. So often they're coming from different positions, as it were, in just terms of where they are in their development pathway. And I often find that coaches get frustrated because athletes don't talk to them, perhaps because they're awkward or perhaps they're shy. And they find it sometimes hard to break down those barriers to the extent that communication is easy. Now, that might be a fault on both sides. So it might be shyness on the part of the athlete, and it might be too much task focus or performance focus on the perspective of the coach. But in the insight that we found from the surveys, the two things that stood out for us were the fact that athletes specifically highlighted that there's not enough conversation about who they are outside of their sport. And so that makes us wonder, in this context in particular, whether that is impacting on coach-athlete relationships. So as human beings, we like to feel that people are interested in us. And a big part of being interested in other people is asking questions to understand who they are. So if you're only understanding a person as an athlete and you're not asking questions about them in terms of the bigger picture of who they are, then the chances are that you're going to get less engagement or less communication, is what I would suggest. And then the other elements that we find that coaches get very frustrated with is that communication has changed massively as well. So from when I was competing, so now when I'm working with athletes who are competing, for example, I work with England Golf, and they use, and some of you will perhaps be familiar with it, they use a social media platform called Coach Now. Now, I'm a dinosaur, and me using something like Coach Now, it's just alien to me. So it becomes, perhaps it's something I have to get better at as a sports psychologist, but it becomes a barrier because the way of communicating has changed as well, and there's that divide between the older generation and the younger generation in that respect as well. I hope that answers your question in some way.
Excellent. I think George Kiley had his hand up next, and then hopefully we can go to Emily afterwards.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, David. Sorry, my camera's playing up, but I'm a PhD student, David, and I'm studying self-determination in elite corporate environments, and I was really interested in cross learnings. And I found it fascinating you talk those clear definitions of success, because that really interests me when those different definitions of success don't tally up and the conflict that can cause. But just to that point, in terms of your contextual enablers, have you done any research or have any thoughts on more macro context? So I think what we discussed there and showed with more micro, more meso, interpersonal relationships, individual, something I'm really fascinated by is those macro systems. So a lot of us, and you talk about young athletes, but we go through a school environment, an education environment where, there's a drive for individualism. We're competing with others, top marks, top exams, top universities, top performance. So some of those macro systems, which I think stem from political, economic, cultural environments, I think they play a key role as well from my research in defining success and have a role in what we believe and value and aspire to. That's a long way of asking. Have you done anything around those macro systems and how that creates a definition of success and therefore plays a role at those more micro and meso level?
Okay, the short answer to that is no. But it's very interesting that you point that out, because those systems appear in our kind of infographics for sports to see and use and understand, but we've looked at it much more from the perspective of how the micro enablers feed into those macro type scenarios, and we haven't actually, if I'm honest, considered it as those as enablers in themselves. But it's really interesting that you've kind of highlighted that, and that is something that I will definitely take back and be discussing with Hamish and Kath in terms of what and how those factors feed into the overall picture of thriving. So no, we haven't done it, but that's really useful information. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I thought it was a great talk. Thank you.
Cheers.
And then if we can really quickly have Emily's mic to squeeze it in.
Very quick. So I suppose, thank you, David. That was really enjoyable. I loved how it was really laid out as well, with the kind of, this is how it looks in terms of thriving and this is how it doesn't look, that kind of really clear behavioral disparity, because then it's much easier to kind of envisage. My main question quickly was about kind of the buy-in from both athletes and coaches in terms of that kind of performance versus holistic element to it, and where you find the challenges are in terms of kind of getting them to actually think, yes, by the way, this is another strategy to being your absolute best, rather than being like, oh, we realized that didn't work, let's go down this avenue. Because I feel like in my mindset and my philosophy as a kind of practitioner, I try and sell it as, by the way, by focusing on you as an individual, this will mean that you can perform even better. But I feel like the kind of traditional coaches and athletes of the world don't necessarily believe that as of yet. But I wondered what your perspective was on that.
Yeah, I think you're right in that, because that's one of the reasons why the project exists in the first place, really, because we're aware that those issues exist within sports in Wales. Within this initial pilot phase, if you like, we I suppose put out a call to see who was interested, and in that instance, we've got people who are already bought into it at this stage. And that, I think, is part of the process of the early stages of the project. We're kind of trying to walk before we can run to a certain extent. We're trying to find the best ways of doing this before hitting any real nasty barriers, finding the pitfalls. And because the sports that we're working with already have, I would say, reasonable cultures, they are open to help us develop the best ways of pulling this out. And they're bought into it. They want to do this. They want to ensure that their environments are as good as they possibly can. And not least because some of them have had issues in the past, and they've done their own navel gazing before they've started working with us to try and figure out, but haven't necessarily been able to do it. And they see this as a pathway that will help them do it. But we're very clear on the fact that down the line that we've got some of those harder tasks that we're going to have to deal with. There are sports that are going to be much more difficult, that have very, very different cultures that surround what they do and how they do it. And the kind of simple things like the chain of command, if you like, between athletes and coaches, which fundamentally goes against what I've just been talking about in terms of the coach-athlete relationship, or some of the old ideas about how coaching should be, and etc. So we haven't encountered that yet. We haven't encountered those difficulties. I've encountered it in my practice as a consultant over many years. And like you, it's about finding the best way to communicate why these things are important, being able to illustrate the fact that if you don't look after the person, actually then it's a bit like that we talk about to athletes focusing on the process rather than the outcome. So I liken this procedure to coach, when I speak to coaches, about taking care of the process. Unless you look after the athlete, they are part of the process. There's your medal up here that you want this athlete to win. If you don't look after this main cog here, then we're not going to get there. So we're not going to achieve what you want, if that's your goal, if that's your driver. But at the same time, you try and get them to change their driver as well. And it doesn't have to all be about performance. You can get satisfaction as a coach, or as a coaching team, or as a culture, from knowing that actually you've had a positive impact on this cog, this human being here in your. So it's just finding ways that.
That's a nice way of saying it. Yeah.
Just finding ways for them to understand it from that perspective. You know, that we talk. I worked within shooting for years and years, and I always used to talk about how, you know, once the bullet leaves the end of the gun, once you've pulled the trigger, there's nothing you can do about the shot. It's all about the process. And that was drummed into athletes. That's what you do. You work on the process. You work on the process. From a coaching perspective, the athlete is part of their process. They have to look after that athlete. If you don't look after that athlete, then the process falls down. And that's kind of usually the way that I highlight it.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you for those excellent questions again from everyone. I realise we've ran over a little bit. Apologies for that. If anybody has any questions, as Adam has already articulated in the Zoom chat, please send them on to us and we can forward them on to David. I'm sure he'll be more than happy to answer any follow-up questions.